I'll hand it over to Zora now to give us the opening remarks for our seminar series, and then we'll be followed by the opening prayer, Wiliongi, I hawhangiaki e hado tūram nang hua he maam hea hone ko inga mohole, matua whakawhikau ko inga mohole. Zora, tuku atu kia koe.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I've got a few words that I've written down. Thank you. Whakaue ke atoa, ke he hana le veki mai, ki a tautolo asi mai ke ai, ke liu whelewea he aho nei. Whakalofa hofi atu, ke he tautangata niue mai he matakau Tupumaiaga a Niue Trust I Okalana New Zealand. Riongi ke whakawhiawhia a tautolo he aho nei mo e tautangata, mo e tau ngā hoa mitaki a tautolo. Kua tause ke lata mai aho nei, whakaue lahi. A short welcome to you all from our team at the Tupumaiaga a Niue Trust. The Tagata Pulotu seminar series will be led today by Ioane Leke Whawai with funds sponsored by the Ministry of Pacific People. Thank you for the application made by Dr. Colin, Tukuitonga, Dr. Nuhisifa Seve-Williams, Bertha Tonga High, and Rosa, Kalauni, Viliko, who are all part of the culture and Wangahau strategic plan, and of which has brought us all here today. Thanks to all the members of the Tupumaiaga a Niue Trust who supported this work, and we acknowledge all the speakers, which is Dr. Nuhisifa Seve-Williams, Rosa Kalauni, Viliko, and Rennie Atfield-Douglas. We would like to acknowledge all our ancestors who have travelled with us in our lives and who have supported our work in the Niue community. They have set our pathways, and we also acknowledge the pathways going forward for all the future generations of Niueans to come. We give thanks to God. Whakamonuina mai he atua. Back to you, Eo. Thank you.
Kawelahi ke he tau manatu whakawhireweia, he tahatakitaki mai he mtakau hado tolu ko Tupumaiaga Niue Trust. Mai honei tuku atu ke hado tolu matua whakawhikau ko Reverend Inga Mohole, ke he whange hado tolu seminar series ke he riongi. Kawelahi.
Sorry guys. Follow for here to get a fair go ke lifu no mai ke hafangi e folua he manual he Tagata Pacifica ke lata ia mo to atu ho. Sigam ia the sea, the melo sea. Tau wiki ha tau wale kwa mau tua iau. Kwa fia lahi ha koe langa kina ha koe Tagata Pulotu mo tau Pulotu fuata haniwe kwa tāna kiaki e whakawhituianga nei. Riongi tau tōru. God of every generation that has been said is yet to be. We praise and thank you for those who have served and shaped and visionary beneath the Southern Cross in our day, raised up and bring us new insight, new challenges, and new confidence in you and the gospel of your Son. Tākina mai, e whawhangu hau koe tua, kia whawhangu mai e whawhangu fōu, kia maua ai e maui fōu, he halamaka he Tagata Pulotu koe tua, kia monu, moe milino, monu, tūtanga loa koe tua, kia kamata ai ai nei e matakau nei, moe tua moe whalanaki, kua whakawiaki he ngoa hau Yesu Kristo, kua kieri ai, e tauanganga halau tolu e tau takitaki, kua haisi ai koe atua nei. E nai to ole atu, e whakaminina anga hau koe atua, hako i ngoa hau Yesu Kristo koe tua me whalanaki a mautulu kiai, ha koe Pulotu, koe hau a mena whakalo whahanganga haia ke he ha mauturu a tau mumui. Amen.
Amen. Whakawelahi ke he me vesi anga ia ke alate he mautu ha moe ha tautoro whakahoroanga he maam hea honi. Vese runga, vese I lalo. Lau tā he aho ka hake mai mo talu fofola ke he nā mata siale o nukutu taha kia whakamunuina mai kia lautoru e ha tautoro tau pulotu tau loto matala he māma he ahuni. Mga huni, tō manako ke whakawhilewi atu kia lautorua ne kua mamna ki ke whakamatala he māma he ahuni. I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Nuhisifa Seve-Williams hails from the village of Avasele. She left Niue at the age of 4 years with her sister and grandmother, bound for New Zealand in 2009. Nuhisifa graduated from the University of Auckland with a Doctor of Philosophy degree. Her research interests are Pacific peoples' histories and culture. Nuhisifa is adherent to the Tawa theory of reality. And also introducing Rennie Atfield-Douglas as a New Zealand raised from the villages of Hakupu, Avasele and Hikutavake. Rennie currently works at the University of Auckland and is at the final parts of his BA Honours, majoring in Pacific Studies. And also introducing Rosa Kalauni Viliko, who originates from the village of Hakupu. Rosa is a trained high school teacher and is currently the head of languages department at the Papatoetoe High School in Auckland. Whakawelahi, pasi mai ki a lata mo lautolu ia, kai tuku atu ki a lautolu he mga hone. Pui tulu.
Cool. Thank you, Eo, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to turn my camera on for this little part and then I'm going to turn it off because I currently work and live in the Cook Islands and the data here is quite expensive. So yeah, I mean, you'll hear my voice, but you won't see my face. But I just wanted to say whakalofalahi atu to you all. And I hope that this session brings you some understanding in terms of Niue history. So I'm just going to turn my camera off. And Eo, if you could just put up the PowerPoint presentation, that would be great. Cool, thank you. Our session, Critical Conversations, the Savage Islander Trope, is a critical discussion of one point in time and space of Niue history from our own perspective. It is important that people listening into this session understand this. And so our perspective is informed by our experiences as educators and as scholars and our readings of historical texts. So in 1774, Captain Cook landed ashore one of the many islands he would name. Now, due to that welcome he received from the people of the island, he would write later in his journals that the conduct and aspect of these islanders occasioned my giving it the name of Savage Island. In naming the island Savage Island, Cook invariably set the stage for historical representations of the people of the island as savages, uncivilized and primitive. This representation would go on to inform further historical representations of the island, its people, and its neighbors in the Great Moana. The panel will discuss the impact of naming and the historical context of those rights, and the problematic representations of the people of Niue and those of the wider Moana that continues on today. So, Eo, I'm sorry, but have you got my PowerPoint up? Because I can see Zora's, I can't see the PowerPoint. Is it up on screen?
Hold up, no, here, it just came off. Oh, I'll put it up again.
Okay, well, while Eo sorts out the PowerPoint presentation, I'll finish off this introduction of ours. So I will start the panel today, and my presentation is entitled Savage Encounters, the Doctrine of Discovery. My presentation will be followed by Rennie Atfield-Douglas, whose presentation is called Niue Savage, an Unwarranted Name. And the last person in our panel is Rosa Kalauni Viliko, whose presentation is called Impact of Being Called Savage Island and Female Invisibility. So yes, we're on slide 3. Yes, that's the one, Neil. Thank you. So Savage Encounters, the Doctrine of Discovery, and then can we go to slide 4? Cool. So as an undergraduate Pacific history student at the University of Auckland in the early 90s, the discovery trope was still vogue and taught. In the dictorials, the Pacific historian will jokingly talk about Pacific peoples in a manner that may not be acceptable today. For example, he would say things like, if the Germans had won World War II, what would our lives be like today? I responded that we would be living in Germany and eating sauerkraut. Much laughter from the class preceded that comment. As innocent as that scenario may have been, what was essentially happening in those classes was reinforcement of an appreciation that encounters with the right Europeans were positive. This was continually reflected through the content of the curriculum being taught and the tutorial discussions. Students were reminded that warfare in the Pacific was endemic, as was cannibalism, and that without the saving grace of the Palangi missionaries, we would have either killed or eaten ourselves to extinction. It was never said, but implied throughout my undergraduate years, studying Pacific history at the history department at the University of Auckland. In regards to discussions about Niue, the historian will jokingly refer to it as Savage Island. It was one of those islands, he would say, that nobody wanted, as it did not have any natural resources. Hence, their many petitions to Great Britain. It was Niue that invited colonialism in, he would say. What was missing from that narrative was that the petitions were in fact seeking protection. Protection from the savage encounters of the Palangi ships and men that roamed the Pacific, kidnapping Pacific men, women and children to work in the mines in Peru and plantations in Queensland. Niue was not immune to the blackbirding trade, and some historical accounts state that 150 men and women were kidnapped at one stage by Bully Hayes. Note the use of the word blackbirding in the historical accounts rather than the use of slavery. Next slide, Neil. I was fortunate at the time of my undergraduate years that I was mentored by a Tongan scholar, Professor Hufanga Christina Mahina, who encouraged us to think critically of Pacific histories and cultures and the manner in which they had been documented by Palangi historians and anthropologists. In 2015, I became involved with an international group of Moana scholars, primarily from the US, Hawaii, and New Zealand, who critiqued the Disney Moana movie. We formed the collective Mana Moana. We are Maui, we are Moana. While the movie would receive a lot of support from Pacific peoples globally, we continued our critiques of the multinational company Disney, who not only culturally mined our story, but repackaged it and sold it back to us. Many Pacific peoples felt at the time that the movie validated their existence, and because of that, more people in the world would understand us. Now, sadly, that's not the case. In this collective were people who shared my own views of what was being written about us, who was controlling the narrative, and how entrenched that narrative is within our own people. For example, as late as 2017, many Niueans still held the belief that Captain Cook discovered Niue. In an online quiz organized by Pacific Media Works Niue program, one of the questions was, who discovered Niue? I recall that many answered that quiz correctly, stating that Captain Cook discovered Niue. Rather than answer that question, I posted on the quiz, why that question? And if Captain Cook discovered Niue, what did the Niueans discover? No reply was forthcoming from the CEO at the time. And although I did contact one of the reporters at the station and ask them why they had that question in the quiz, it wasn't really satisfactory to me, but I left it at that. So in 2019, I wrote a letter to the Minister of Pacific Peoples, Minister Zora, in support of the efforts of Tina Ngata, who was also a member of the Mana Moana Collective. Tina was leading the movement against the commemoration of the Cook celebrations in New Zealand. Excerpts of my letter to Minister Zora read, can I have slide 6, Io? Io. Okay. To spend millions of dollars on a celebration that continues to reinforce the ideas associated with the doctrine of discovery is to give sanction to the insidious concept of terra nullius. This concept lies at the heart of the doctrine of discovery and legitimize the conquest and colonization of lands by European explorers and settlers. Terra nullius deemed indigenous peoples as non-Christians and therefore not human, and as such their lands were empty. The doctrine justified the conquest of lands in the Moana and assumptions of Māori and Pacific peoples as savages, inferior and uncivilized, in need of Christianity and civilization. Early writings by explorers like Cook are explicit examples. These assumptions would be documented, would be documented and become the historical accounts of Māori and Pacific peoples that would be taught as history in schools in New Zealand. It would inform Palangi perceptions of Māori and Pacific peoples that are negative and that continues on today. We need only to look at our social and economic indicators to understand the impact of these assumptions on our place in New Zealand society. It is also evident in recent public commentaries that follow when the Prime Minister of New Zealand invests in Pacific nations, when Māori seek to have Te Reo Māori taught in schools, and when a public broadcaster shows disdain for Pacific. And I ended the letter with this comment. What is apparent in this celebration is acknowledgement that anything prior to the point of contact, like the feats of Māori and the voyaging wakas that sailed from the Pacific and their settlement of Aotearoa, is insignificant and secondary. Effectively, it validates terra nullius because it denies the existence of Māori as the indigenous population and their ways of living and cultures. And so to date, I haven't had a response from the minister, but you know, I didn't think I would get a response, but I sent the letter to him anyway. The Labour government did indeed, you know, continue on what the National Party had started in terms of the celebration. So it was no, again, I just moved on because I felt that at least I had let the Minister of Pacific Peoples know that, you know, that the celebration was not great. So what is the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery, also known as the doctrine of Christian discovery, is an international legal concept and Christian principle that is born out of a number of Catholic laws called papal bulls, originating out of the Vatican in the 15th and 16th century. It gave the monarchies of Britain and Europe the right to conquer and claim lands and to convert or kill the native inhabitants of those lands. Now, Tina Nata writes that the intent of the doctrine was to sanction Christian explorers in the name of their king or queen to lay claim to territories uninhabited by Christians. If the lands were vacant, then they could be defined as discovered and sovereignty claimed. Within the framework of the doctrine, Indigenous peoples were considered non-human. The doctrine asserts that non-Christians on discovered lands were not human, and therefore the land was empty or terra nullius. So, for example, when Cook arrived in Australia, there were up to 750,000 people living there who had been living in those lands for over, 65,000 years. However, he declared the land terra nullius, which means he declared the Indigenous people of Australia to be not human and the land empty. Cook claimed the land for King George III. Now, in Aotearoa, Hobson, on order from the British Crown, declared the South Island terra nullius in 1840 and then claimed it for the Crown. So in 2012, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues denounced the doctrine as shameful root of all discrimination and marginalisation that Indigenous peoples face today. It noted that while such frameworks of domination and conquest were promoted as authority for land acquisition, they also encourage assumptions that Indigenous people were savages, barbarians, inferior, and uncivilized. The doctrine of discovery is a legal foundation for many of the court cases and pieces of legislation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that have alienated Māori land. The doctrine continues to dispossess Indigenous people of their rights every day because the laws and politics that grew out of the doctrine have come to shape society's ideas and attitudes about Indigenous peoples globally and our rights. As Moana Jackson eloquently puts it, implicit in the doctrine is assumption that to open up Indigenous lands to the gaze of the colonizing other, there is also in their view an opening up of everything that was in and of the land being claimed. Thus, if the doctrine of discovery suggested a right to take control of another nation's land, it necessarily also implied a right to take over the lives and authority of the people to whom the land belonged. So why is it important that we know about this? As Niueans, it's important for us to know this, as this is the context for which Cook and other European explorers set out to conquer, to dispossess, and to name. While our Niuean ancestors were able to push back on Cook in the first encounter, they were not able to push back on other encounters. As well as giving Niue the name Savage Island, Cook also gave the directions to Niue. It was also important for us to understand that contact was Il, can you just go back to the other slide because we're not there yet? Yes, stay there. It's also important for us to understand that contact was intentional and the role of Christianity was to humanize the savage. To convert them to Christianity was to make them human in their eyes. Christianity was a mechanism for colonization. The legacy of these assumptions born out of the doctrine are structural racism in the many institutions that we engage with on a daily basis, and the legal frameworks that sanction the operation of these institutions. Now, to understand this is to understand who the real savages were. So I wanted to end my presentation with just going through a number of slides about a number of map slides. So Eel, are you able to go to the, no, you've missed one. Have you missed a slide? There's a slide that's,
Yeah.
No, can you go back? Before Tupaia's maps, there's a slide that's,
She's saying there's one before this.
can you just go back?
So you go.
Okay, okay, one of the slides didn't come up, but one of the slides was what the moana looked like before the intrusion, and you can actually, not this slide, and it is in the first set of slides when I started out. And so in that particular slide, you'll see, and I took that photo of the map then because when I visited the Vatican in 2018, and you'll see from that slide that that there's big open space where the moana was, and so that was, you know, and you can see from that the doctrine of discovery had not kicked in. Now this one here, this slide here is the slide of Tupaia's map of the moana, and Tupumaia, for many of you who might not know, was the one that that helped Cook find his way to New Zealand, but also helped Cook to navigate the Pacific. Now Niue is on this map, and the best way to read this map, I don't know what happened to the blue line, but Niue is there, and in Tupaia's in a paper on the map, can you see that Niue is there? It's called Honui. So it's down there somewhere, but the arrow is missing from that. And then we'll go into the next map. The next one, and so that's what the moana looked after mapping, after it had been mapped out. And then the last slide is what the moana looks like during the colonization period. And as you can see, there's Niue is actually called New Zealand in there, and New Zealand and the Cook Islands. So it's interesting. But that's what the moana looked like after the colonization period. And so I wanted to end on that and hand it over to Rennie, who will talk about his presentation, Niue Savage and Unwarranted Name. Over to you, Rennie.
Whakawelahi nuhi. I'll just get my presentation up. Can everybody see that? Yep. Whakalofala ia tu kia tautulu osi, whakaue whakamua ke he whakalofa he atua esi mai ke a tautulu ke whirewia he aho nei. Mua atu tau whakalofa ke he tau lilifu hakua hohoko mai. Thank you also to Reverend for being here as well. So my topic that I'm going to look at is exploring Savage Island in terms of the name itself. And I titled it Savage Island, an Unwarranted Name, because actually it's a name that we didn't want, nor did we even think of our own island in this kind of way. But before I actually get into you know, some of the things about Maitala Noa, I just wanted to also introduce to you all who I am and how I'm in front of you. Now, I do want to also acknowledge that I'm still on my own journey of learning. I'm currently a student at the University of Auckland, studying a Bachelor of Arts Honours in Pacific Studies. I have a Bachelor of Health Sciences, which I finished a number of years ago, and I've come back to study in recent years because I was really saddened to see the number of Niue research out there that was actually published by Niueans. So I'm the youngest of 6 children. I was the only one born in New Zealand. Most of my siblings were born in Niue. I was born and raised in Manurewa, South Auckland, so all of my schooling took place in lower decile schools. And currently I work with young people here at the University of Auckland. Nuhi and Io said I'm from Avasele Hakupu and Hikutavake. The first thing I wanted to kind of present to you was when we think of the word savage, what are the connotations that we have with this word? So what kind of feelings do we have when we hear the word savage? And when I mean the word savage, I mean out of context in relation to Niue. So I know that we do, when we think of savage, we've gone through kind of a reclamation of the word in some of our circles, but in isolation, what does the word savage actually mean in terms of the connotations? And these are a few things that I came up with, and they were actually listed also on the little blurb that Io and that Io kind of sent out. So when we think of savage, we think of uncivilized, we think of untamed, you also think of cruel, wild, primitive, inferior. So the word savage itself, the connotations that are connected with it are not really positive. You know, they are really kind of insidious descriptions. And so when we think about Niue, what does the word savage mean for Niue people? So does the word savage mean something different to Niue people? And I won't answer that question in this Talanoa, but maybe we can discuss it afterwards. And I'd like you to be reflective of your own journey, wherever it may be. You know, when you look at the term savage, are you proud of that? And how does that how do you kind of show that pride? Or do you denounce the word savage and think, actually, no, that's not a name that we had? And it's interesting that Nuhi also showed that we're on Tupaia's map. You know, I never knew that on Tupaia's map we were there and that we're known as Hunui. This is a picture also in a depiction of Cook coming onto shore in Niue. And for those, and I'm sure we all know that he tried a couple of times to come, and our people were just too strong. So Savage Island in itself, what's in a name? Pretty self-explanatory. Cook had a really bad time in Niue, and I think some of the stories say that someone actually threw a stone and it nearly hit him. If only it did. The other part also is who gave Captain Cook the authority to give Niue Whekai this name. So we, as Indigenous Niue people, already had names for our island. Who gave him the authority? And Nuhi actually covered this. You know, explorers actually thought, oh, we're going to go and we're going to claim these lands because they're, you know, unkept. And I think that that's actually really problematic. And what we'll look at in the further parts of my presentation is kind of the legacy of this approach. So like I did mention, is the name is unwarranted. And Niue people were only protecting their island. As we know, there would have been warfare back and forth within the island itself, and probably most likely with other people from within Polynesia. And so it makes perfect sense that if someone was coming into our homes trying to take it from us, that we would retaliate. And I really am happy that our Niue people had the courage and the capability to kind of push back Cook from Niue, because I think what would have happened had he been allowed to come on shore? And in the end, if you don't know, the Hawaiians got him. And Nuhi kind of also talked about this as well. You know, Cook and his fellow colonizers had a sense of Western entitlement, and that is actually purposeful. That there was an intention there. They knew what they were doing, and they had complete disregard to the people that were on there, on those islands, including Niue, and that's how they felt that they could rename, these islands that they were so-called discovering. I mean, even if we look at this example, so even the geographical names of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, they're really problematic. We look at Melanesia, it means dark. I mean, if that's not you know, a racist description of those types of people, then I don't know what is. And so it's, for us, it's being aware of these kind of legacies that exist, and being critical of them and not always just accepting them. Now I'm going to look at the noble savage versus the ignoble savage. So in terms of the noble savage and the ignoble savage, they're kind of opposites of each other. So the noble savage is kind of touted as good and untainted. They have this romanticized kind of description of them. You know, they're kind of almost innocent, like a childlike innocence located in nature. That's the noble savage, and there is a kind of a depiction of the noble savage all throughout history from about the 15th century onwards. And then we have the ignoble savage, which is kind of the opposite. So they kind of describe the ignoble savage as evil and tainted, lack of reasoning, depraved human behavior, cannibalistic tendencies, unpredictable. And one of the things that's been able to happen is that these two, the noble savage versus the ignoble savage, have been counted off each other. So, you know, you're either one or the other, or, you know, why are you not a noble savage, or you're such an ignoble savage, so to speak. Now, the noble savage term is used by the West to perpetuate control over Indigenous people. So there's a whole lot of literature around the noble savage, and probably not enough time for me to unpack it in here, but that's kind of where it comes from. And so what does the noble savage actually mean? It's really an unobtainable level of kind of purity that the West puts on kind of Indigenous peoples. It's really a representation of an Indigenous person who has not been corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolizes an innate goodness. And it's an unrealistic representation of the Indigenous other. So it's, unfortunately, we are othered a lot, even today. And, you know, these kind of descriptions are used to kind of perpetuate some of the oppressive systems that we still face as people. And ultimately, this is based on Indigenous people being so, quote unquote, inferior and based on control. Yeah, I just saw the comment. Hang on. So the ignoble savage. So this, again, a term used by the West to perpetuate control over Indigenous peoples, impure, rough, lack of any moral order, and it reduces the kind of difference between the noble savage and the ignoble savage is it reduces us to kind of compete against each other. So they romanticize the noble savage, like this is the epitome of what an Indigenous person should be like, and versus an ignoble savage who's, you know, despised and hated. And that is actually crafted in a really clever way, and it even happens today. I mean, we also subject ourselves to this kind of interaction as well by using Western markers of kind of success or normality. And an example is including the way that we look. So the color of our skin tone, you know, and whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's there. Now, the reclamation of the savage narrative is really important. And it's a discussion that, you know, even myself, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And you can kind of connect this probably to the reclamation of the N-word by African Americans in America. You know, when you think about it, so newer people have moved towards the reclamation of the term savage. And when we talk about the term savage in a lot of contexts today, it's a really positive thing. But should we be denouncing this term completely and embrace our own terms? You know, do we have terms of that are readily available to us? We have toa, we have other things that we can use that can still have the same sentiment, you know, as the sentiment that we're trying to get by the reclamation of the savage term. The thing with the savage narrative is it actually has real life consequences. And Nuhi mentioned this, systemic racism is an example. and it perpetuates untruths. And we saw this during the dawn raids. So during the dawn raids here in New Zealand, Pacific, and their anniversary is next week, which is kind of fitting. Their 50th anniversary to celebrate them is happening next week. But with Pacific people here in Aotearoa, they were hunted really by New Zealand because they didn't want us anymore, despite the fact that the number of people who were overstayers was largely represented by people who, well, by Anglo immigrants. So the British, the Americans, Australians, they far outnumbered the number of overstayers in comparison to the number of Pacific peoples. So this is my very last slide, and it's looking at ways forward. So what are some things that we can, do when we're thinking about the savage trope? So learn and develop our own epistemologies, our own ways of being. And for me, my journey back to academia was unexpected. I thought I was settled in a career, but what I really noticed is that we needed more people to be telling our own stories and controlling our own narratives. I was sick of seeing narratives that were shared by outsiders, and not that there's not a place for them in this space, but we need to reclaim what's ours. And like I mentioned before, be critical of the information that's being shared and understand the context that it's shared in. Really understanding the context will give you an ability to be critical of that information. And the last one is, it should say, own our knowledge. Our own knowledge is legitimate. So for a long time, we've been told that what we know is not good enough, when in reality, it actually is. And that for me is probably the key point that I want to kind of relay, is that our own knowledge is legitimate, whether it comes from a New Zealand born, raised, Niuean lands, or a Niue born, raised Niuean lands, or outside of these two countries, it's just as legitimate. So I'm going to leave it there, and I will hand it over to Rosa, who will follow up with our third part.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Hello everybody. Whakalawhalaia, whakau kona nofo, me whanonganongo ke tau whapetalanga ke lata mea whiawhine. I might talk, I'm sorry, Nui, I was lost the very last minute. So last Wednesday, I was invited to be part of this conversation. And my immediate response was, yes, I'll do something for the women. But as I thought about it, there's not enough time. So it's changed now. It's changed now. So what I did was I went out to, I went on social media and messaged as many people, as many women as I could with a question. And the question that I put to them is, how do you feel as a female growing up Niuean in the context of Niue as Savage Island? And I just left it ended for them to respond to. And 7 people responded. And then with behind that question was talahawanga he hako matua ne pehe ko tumi tangata he hana. Ke mui ko hanga mitaki kia ia. We seek experiences that reward us. And so I was looking through pictures that may depict the attempts by Captain Cook to land on the Niue shores. I couldn't find much. So if you're still with us, Nisa, love a picture of Apahi if you can. Te hanei hape tolu my mini action research. Fitu ala tolu e tau toa ne tali mai e huhu haku. Not necessarily these women in front of you, but out of that, seven women who replied with the responses, there were 3 young-ish kind of fifine, and 2 in the 50, 60 age range, and 2 in the 61 to 70 age range. So we lahi au ki la tolu mea la tolu tau latamokoi. Kua tali mai aku hu ki la matai ki whakatutalanga nei hatou tūlu. Out of those responses I got 3 threads that I could follow. I didn't have time to analyze or synthesize the information, but I think in terms of what I discovered from the response, it was far and wide. It'll be I'm tempted now to do another master's. It'll be a thesis by the end of this. The initial response, I just copy and paste the responses as they had given it. And I've come up with 4 different subheadings. And of course, Rennie has covered and touched on noble savages, the concept of noble savages. And I could relate these responses to that concept. My fierce and true to Nukututaha. They actually like it. And they uphold the Nukututaha's supremacy. It means that we are fierce, brave, and very proud. And there was a young lady, was a New Zealand born, grew up in the context of Māori. And she believes that being surrounded by Māori warriors would actually say that feeling of protected, being protected, our own culture that she knows very little about. Another idea, another thread that was coming across very strongly, I think, was our disassociation with the term Savage Island. We somehow have tried to disassociate ourselves from being recognized or known as somebody from Savage Island. And the attitude comes across like, I don't care. That's how they perceive me, but that's not how I perceive myself. We'll just let the Palangi see us the way they want to see us, but we continue as who we are. And the name actually has absolutely nothing to do with who I am. So this, to me, gives me an idea that maybe our female warriors are very staunch Niueans who are not allowing anything to get them from somebody else's perspective. So once again, these are only just my straight off the top of my head kind of thing. Wednesday till today, pretty quick research. But this is what they come up with. So there's 2 threads there. One was the noble savages. The second one is the attitude, our attitude towards this name being given to us by disassociating it from what and who we are and how we perceive ourselves. And the other strong thread that was coming through very strongly is that they're not fond of that name. So that'll probably support what Kiwi was talking about. Oh, sorry, Rennie and Nuhi were talking about earlier. Because with that name comes a lot of negative connotations. And there was one particular, I think she's a young lady, she resents it and wished that it doesn't exist and stop referring, especially encouraging our young people to stop referring to ourselves as people from the background of savage. The other one did not like the war dance because it represents that savagery idea that was placed upon us anyway. And generally it's that feeling that we are being unfairly. You covered that really well, because it allows the Palangis to have that sense of wisdom and entitlement, like you said. So for these young people, there's a lot of comments coming out of the 7 people who find it a derogatory name being given to young people of today, especially our women today. Ooh. On the other hand, we also have this I don't have an issue with the name. And one of them actually was saying, if we get the job done, that's all that is needed. And one of the matuas had also went into length telling me that the takala was done by women earlier, in the earlier times, especially down at the wharf. It was probably before my time. I'm just taking her wisdom and her word for it because she had witnessed it herself. And this also the echo of, we're proud that we were able to challenge them, the forces from around the world coming through Niue the earlier time, especially when referencing Captain Cook. And in terms of discover Niue, the question was thrown out there today earlier. One of the matuas was singing the phrase that Huanaki Whao discovered Niue. And I know, and I remember I've heard it a few times at our whanos, at other meetings, is that it was not right that a Palangi perspective can take over the discovery of Niue like Captain Cook did it. But I think in terms of where that came from, they have the written word for it. Huanaki did not have a book, but I think it's up to us to put that message forward. We really want to put this discovery of Captain Cook on the back burner. The other lady also had indicated, despite the name, it's never hindered my ability to be a woman from Niue. And one of the young ladies suggested that maybe it's been normalized and therefore it's been accepted. And now a lot of our young people are gravitating to it and making it a cool thing to be part of. And I think our Polyfest performances has a lot to do with that as well. But it's not really us. So in terms of these responses, like I said, I haven't had time to synthesize or find the material that will back up what has been said, or further look into what other people are responding to the question. The other one that came through pretty strongly for me from the singing people is that Niue's individualistic nature. And they are proud regardless of the name given to it or the name that defines it. Some of them were saying that it defined us, some of them say it didn't define us, but regardless of that, Niue is very, very unique in its own way. And the challenges are there. One of them actually put a challenge to it to me. It's up to us to make the change. And I think the conversations like today, I think we will have the opportunity to make those changes. It may be shorter than 10 minutes, but there's a lot of information there, and I think it's got a scope for further development and further discussion. I wish to thank all the 7 toa leka Niue, tō matu whiwhine, me te whaata whiwhine, kua tali mai huhu, me lau matai ki hata tōru a tau whakatu talanga hea whiwhine, ke lata moe mata kupu ia koe whakaingoa anga Niue ko Savage Island. The only thing short, I think, it limits what my information and data I present to you this afternoon is that there was no young voice in there. But with the time restraints, I'm pretty lucky to get responses from 7 people. So elahi au e talo, monuina hata tolo whawhituyanga me a whiwhine.
O e lahi ki hea tūra te pulotu he mga hua whiwhine, mo he mtūra tau whalawhalaanga. Te loto matalahanga au ia ki he matauru he whatutalaanga, koe whakahingoanga he mutu atu tulu, ko Niue ne whakahingoa he Tupapalangi with Savage Island. Now I'm going to open it up to anyone who has any questions for our panelists for this afternoon. Tuku atu ke lata me te huhu whamalema. Koe tahe uhu, one of the questions that came up in the chat was how did they measure cannibalism dangerous? Tahe uhu e ni hake mai, making a mtolo ke tali mai.
How did they measure cannibalistic tendencies? they couldn't.
They used the European measuring stick.
I think one of the things in terms of some of the historical accounts, in particular about Niue, is that Niue, according to those accounts, Niue did not have any cannibalistic tendencies, and it was outside of Niue that there were cannibals. So there's some historical accounts around that Niueans were not cannibals. Now, I don't know, as you all know, we weren't there at the time, but that's what's been recorded in terms of some of the historical accounts.
Yeah, I also think it was just another kind of term for control, to say, look, it was basically pushed on savages, this kind of term. It's an untruth for us, probably.
So there was somebody who, I think it's OEM to everyone. Did you want to expand a little bit on that statement of yours? That it sounds like we have a lot of unlearning of untruths that colonizers have installed and encouraged in the educational sector. Did you want to expand on that comment of yours?
Yeah, it's me. I just think that there's been a lot of information or misinformation that's been in the educational sector, or, that is not necessarily true, and we have to take this back on board for our next generation. So I think that there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do because of the myths and the untruths that have been told to us, that now we're finally recognizing our indigeneity, that it's coming out and we're becoming stronger as a nation, that I think we need to start making these untruths the correct truths. That's just all I wanted to say, is that there's been enough of these myths floating around that sort of add to the misunderstandings or the untruths that are in the environment that we need, that now our indigeneities are coming up. And it's important for us to be able to take that back and say, actually, who told you that? Why do you think that's true when actually it's not? So that's just my 5 cents worth. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Rennie also posed a question, I think, in his presentation, read the reclamation of the word savage. Was there anybody that wanted to comment on that question, on that comment? That a lot of our young people are now trying to reclaim the word savage and using it in their reclamation. Rennie, did you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, of course. So basically, I posed the question, should we be denouncing this term completely and embrace our own terms? And so it's really just being critical of that term itself, because, and if we go back to the first part of my presentation, how I speak about the connotations that are associated with the word savage, they're all generally negative. So why would, and this is a question, this is why would we perpetuate that negativity, even though it's a reclamation of sorts in that space? But, you know, I know that with some of the young people that I work with, their connection to Niue may be really limited. And so a lot of their exposure, like Rosa said, is through things like Polyfest and, you know, being a toa and showing savagery in that context is actually really mana enhancing, you know, so to speak. And I can understand why our young people would gravitate towards wanting to reclaim that word. Carlos also put a message in here. So I think that, and he says, I think that stems from where we are as a people in New Zealand, where a lot of our youth are disconnected from our culture and language. And so what they have access to is what is written. And that I believe that as well. You know, the accessibility to culture for some of our Niue people is limited. And actually the facts show that Niueans are amongst some of the most ethnically diverse Pacific people in Aotearoa now. I think when I looked at the statistics, over half of Niue people identify with more than one ethnicity. And so you add that into the mix. So not only are you growing up outside of, you know, the motherland, and in some cases two homelands, you now have the complexity of only having, you know, one parent who's Niuean, or maybe even that parent's part something else too. So these are all kind of challenges that our young people face. Carlos, did you want to elaborate on your comment?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I just think it's, like I said, it's just a reflection of where our youth are. They are disconnected to what we would probably deem as real Niue. So what they do have access to is what they read in schools. So I guess it is the importance of reclaiming our history, reclaiming who we are as a people, and rewriting. But I also have a question for the panel in terms of, we go on about what Captain Cook documented about us naming us Savage Island, and I think for the most part, a lot of our matuas do take offense when talking about Niue, when you do mention Savage Island, but in the same breath, they would proudly proclaim being from Niue Whekai. And my understanding, Niue Whekai is similar to Savage Island, and it's also a foreign term that was named by another foreign group, which from what I've read, please correct me if I'm wrong, that it was the Tongans that actually named us Niue Whekai, or gave us the term Whekai. But it's just funny that, like, we have an issue with Savage Island, but at the same time, we're proud Niue Whekai. Like, just a question.
Yeah. There's also a question there from Lorena. They'll probably be in the same stream as what Carlos is speaking about.
Oh, we can't see Lorena's question.
Let me bring it up. Sorry, hang on. I'll share it on the screen. Can you see? It also may be in line with what you're talking about, Rennie, about reclaiming it.
Aiki sia Losa.
You not see my screen?
No, Aiki sia, we can't see the question.
It's here. Can you see my mouse?
Naha.
No.
Oh, now we can. Or do you just want to read the question?
We just need to leave the Western views to them and start putting out our own stories, views, so to reclaim it and what that looks like. It's the same kind of conversation that we looking at. Maybe we need to start writing our histories and putting them out there, because it seems like a lot of people are making references to what's available to them And our biggest weakness is not having enough resources for our young people.
I think that's one of the challenges, though, and we get a lot of those challenges from a number of people, particularly on social media, around critiques of non-Niueans writing our histories. And one of the things that people don't really recognize is the fact that our capacity at the moment in order to write those stories is very limited. And also the priorities for many people who could write are very different. And so there's only, and then until that capacity grows, then we're always going to have these challenges. Now, a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people think that we can just run off, research and write those stories, but we can't. It doesn't work like that. Publication doesn't work like that. But, you know, I suppose one of the things that I do recall trying to do many years ago was trying to fill a gap, was trying to get people to write their own family history books. And through their own documentation of their family books, then they would be able to share those stories to their own, you know, to their own families, especially the ones that were growing up in New Zealand without any connection to Niue. And so that was my kind of attempt at trying to bridge a gap. But it is a big gap, and we have to recognize that, you know, at the moment, our capacity is still quite small.
I think just to echo on what Nuhi was saying as well, like the challenge is that, you know, and I was doing this before, is I was waiting for the research to come, but actually the research won't come unless we want it to come. And that, I think, is the part that we have to enable our, it doesn't just sit on the shoulders of our young people, but it sits on the shoulders of everyone from our motu to actually recognize that there's a need to share these stories. And I think part of the challenge is also, you know, we're used to some type of, you know, legitimization process, and people can say, oh, I'm not really a good writer, or that's not really my thing. But it's actually not even about that. It's about just recording the things down so that we have some type of record, like the history books in itself are amazing. And I've read a number of family history books, and the stories that you have from those books and the richness of those books actually allow some of the themes and some of the really intricate details of your family ngafa and genealogy come right through. And I know that that's actually excited a lot of families, and it's gone further. And so basically someone needs to start something somewhere, and it kind of grows. It's like it's like losing weight, I guess. You've got to start one day at a time. But Blake, I saw your comments down here too. Did you want to elaborate on that? So. Oh, we can't hear you, Blake. Oh, that's okay. I'll read out Blake's comment. So the issue has always been a lack of resources as well as the view of authenticity. So that's exactly what I was just talking about, or acceptance of specific bodies. I guess the other challenge for us is that, you know, we are critical always of our own people the most, right? So there has to be, we have to just overcome that and face the criticism, because that's just how things roll with, you know, with society. I see Carlos has another comment in here. Also, the lack of clarity around what is anga whakamutu niue and what isn't. Yes, and a perfect example of that is the takalo at funerals, right? Like, let's not go there in this stala no, because we'll go down a rabbit hole. But That's exactly it. In the context of New Zealand, our youth are often confused. So they're left to make their own narratives or understanding of what they read, what they hear, and what they are taught or not taught. So they cling on to things like Takalo and read a book about Niue being savages. And we then have the emergence of the perceived positive side of the name Savage Island. Now, I know we have some younger people. I know Anton had his video on. Anton, did you want to comment as well, or just putting it out there to anyone? Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Oh, okay. Whakawhalaia atu ki matolosi. I just wanted to come on here and it's a really interesting topic to talk about, and I think for me, being one of the youth or young adults coming up through high school and going through Polyfest, and with this idea of I think just being a savage or going into the Tagalo, it was really like, I don't know, I never really saw it as almost uncivilized and villainized in that way, although it gave me a sense of power. And I think for us coming through with the limited resources to, like, these discussions and stuff, it's just a matter of what we see. And what I was watching back then, it was just my older cousins doing the Tagalo at 21st and obviously at Polyfest, and what they put on the TV screen. And I was like, oh, okay, that's highly encouraged. I'll just go with that. So yeah, I just want to put a question forward to the panel on how could we make that more accessible to the youth in a way that it speaks the same language towards what they do, like how they speak, or and just finding these conversations for people in high school, that, because I didn't have access to that, and yep, that's me. Whakolahi.
Well, I think one of the things, sorry, in terms of the youth in New Zealand, is that the issues that you're facing now are the same issues that many of us faced when we were also young and growing up in New Zealand. There was nothing really, we were not taught any of it. And so one of the ideas is that our histories were taught to us, was passed down to our, from us to our parents. Now that didn't happen in my family. And so it was not until, and in high school, of course, nothing in those days when I went to high school in the late 70s. So the issues you're talking about now are the same issues we had. It was only when I started to go to university that I began to critically read the historical accounts of Niue. And it was a decision on my part to find that out myself, is to understand who I was and what I was. And so I think I do understand what a lot of our young people are going through in terms of finding their own identities. And I like the question that Carlos has posed about anga whakamotu. What is it in the context of New Zealand, for the New Zealand born? And I think that's a question that only they can answer, because it is very different for the New Zealand born as opposed to those in Niue. And so we do have a session coming up very soon. One of the things I did notice that I observed myself in my later age is that we have many of our young people become selective about what they want to learn about Niue. So they want to learn the exciting things like the takalo and the performance arts, but they don't want to learn about Niue itself. Do you know what I mean? They want to do all those things, but they don't want to know where these things came from. So that's one observation that I observed. Now, it may not be true. Someone can correct me. But Rennie and Rosa, over to you guys. We've got some questions here from a...
Yeah, Joanna, do you want to elaborate on your comment? That's really interesting, Fuki.
whalawhalai atu. Ke he tauririfu kua mai ki he whelewia ke mahanai. We hear me ke Tagata Pulotu. Thank you very much for sharing. I was just wanted to know, well, are these stories shared in our families and in our communities? Because being here in Sydney is different. We are here because by choice and studies and families, and then we can make up our own culture and make up our own stories. Unless there is facts, grounding facts that we can believe or hear, like this forum today. And even in New Zealand, it's different. So how are we living this? And even just to, if you're being called savage on wherever you go, well, obviously you will be offended because it's not a very nice term to hurt anyone. But it's so true that we did have that mana of our tupunas having believing in nature and a lot of things that should be more encouraged and told as stories. And going back to the remark that Nuhi had just shared, it's so true that we can only pick up what we want to hear, but not actually going back to know the depth of it. So I hope that would reflect back to you, Zora.
I wanted to pick up on Lillian's comment. Lillian, you had a comment there. Did you want to just share that? Because I think it's an important comment. So Lillian's still there?
Still online.
Lillian, did you want to talk about...
Nuhi, whalawhātu, whalawhai, leat ke te tulosi a whiawhi. Koe hākua manatu, tolahi e mahuinga e kupu nei ne tutala to turu ki ai hako hata tula to whānau ka. It's true, we have to acknowledge our youth and our young people and to understand the name savage, which is given to us in Niue. But we as the matures, I feel like they don't have the energy to go back and talk about savage, but what they do more now is to celebrate their Christianity. It's just as important. So, I've written this down, so maybe it could be a topic in another talk. Tutala whauelahi ke ham tūla tūla lianga moe tutala ke lat moe hado tūla tō whānau. Nava moe whiawhia moe whakauia kim tūlosi whauelahi.
I wanted to pick up on your ahoe he mama, Lillian, because one of the things that we see a lot that happens, particularly around our histories, is that there are two divisions. There is the division of the darkness, and then there's the division of the light. And so often the Niueans will recognize the light, but they won't recognize the dark. Now the dark is where our cultural contexts are, where our traditional knowledge is. And it's very interesting because often you will hear in many churches is that, this is that the light only happened when Christianity came into Niue. Everything before Christianity was the darkness. So in terms of our own cultures, in terms of our traditional knowledge, that's actually in the dark for many people. I just wanted to pick up on that comment, and maybe it's a discussion that will happen next week when we have critical conversations on Christianity. Maybe the presenter will pick up on it.
Yeah, we'll have Reverend Dr. Matangi Vilitamat speaking to religion next week.
Go ahead, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make a comment to say, and just thank you everyone for the discussion. I think from my own perspective, I see it that, and like you said, Nuhi, when we were growing up, we didn't know much ourselves, and before the opportunity is missed, I think we need people like yourself to continue with the research and to be able to have our own and add to our own narratives. I've never really formally spoken out my own narratives because I don't have the evidence apart from my own people, you know, my grandparents, my parents, and I don't have the verification that can qualify the truthness in that. So I just keep it to myself and share it within my own family. But it's always been enlightening for me to read other people's research, and I do value that they've put the time and the effort because I know how hard it is. And I think that's what it is. It needs more people to pick up those questions and to delve more into our history of it. So, but thank you for the conversation.
Hello. There's a young lady with another question I'd like to pick up on too. So I'm trying to find it. I think it's Doreen. She asked if it is wrong to think that we as a people are amazing in our own rights and don't need to follow ideas that history has tried to place on us and move forward, understanding the past, learning from it, and not letting it make us feel inferior, because we are not. Is it wrong, she asks. So maybe, Doreen, you might want to elaborate on that before other people can add their feedback. That is if you're still in the room.
Is she still in the room? Oh, there she is. She's in Disneyland, so it's too loud.
Thank you for your contribution. What dedication. That's awesome.
I don't think that the term savage makes us feel inferior. I think what we need to learn about the historical accounts is its legacy today in terms of our place, in terms of what's happening out there currently, and how those representations have impacted on intergenerationally for us. And so if we understand where these things come from, then we would have a better chance of navigating it or responding to it when we see it. So I don't think the term savage makes us feel inferior, but I think we need to understand the roots for a lot of the structural racism that happens now. And a lot of it goes back to that doctrine.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
Well, there was another question from Rob. As the doctrine of discovery enters more into people's consciousness, how do we reconcile these learnings of our history with our faith? Is that a question for next week, or maybe?
Yeah, I believe so. So I hope Rob will be on that session for next week. Rob?
But I think, though, you can reconcile it. I mean, it's quite easy. You're still a Christian, even though you're a much more aware Christian of some of the things. It doesn't mean that you don't become a Christian, that you don't continue on being a Christian because you learn about the doctrine of discovery. It just means you have to navigate those two things. Yeah, it's like, you know, going to university in terms of science and Christianity. How do we navigate those? Well, many of us have navigated it quite well. We've still come out with a degree and we're still Christians.
Two other points I think they're very, very important. One that was raised by Lorena. about a stigma of being New Zealand born, and it has been a barrier to New Zealand born. I think that's a very important discussion because we're looking at preserving what's awareness in terms of our young people coming through. And the other point that was raised as well was Janice Ikiua on education, learning of culture and things, Niue. Those are two points. I think if people could, maybe Lorena and Janice could elaborate on those points. Others can add to it.
Can you hear me?
Hear you loud and clear, nice.
Hello, everyone. I just guess that when you're brought up in New Zealand and there's a whole lot of, it's different obviously to being in Niue. Our Niuean people too scared to take the plunge and learn their culture or learn anything because they've been assimilated to their surroundings of what they're brought up. Probably back then would be Māoridom or whatever, or the other culture as Blake alluded to, and if they're of two cultures. So yeah, it was just, it just puts sometimes being mocked, you know, being mocked within your own families. It's not even just in general, people, when you try, you know, and you get mocked, no one will want to try again. Those kind of things, and that puts the barrier on those that want to learn furthermore. That's all I meant.
Thank you, Lorena.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lorena. I think that is part of the challenge, right? Is that we are really critical of our own. And I know from interactions that I've had, the other thing also is that, you know, for me, when I'm speaking Niuean, my Niuean is a work in progress, like probably a lot of people's. But some people don't correct me. So you think you're saying the right thing, and then you don't realize until weeks later when you're like, oh, that would have been nice to know that word is not used like that. And I think that people are being polite, but you know, we've got to enable people to be able to participate in these things. But also on the flip side, there has to be a want from us to want to do it. You know, there genuinely has to be a structure shift, not only, you know, the structures that we live in, but the structures of our own homes. We have to enable the immersion of Wangahau Niue in there if it's going to change the trajectory that we're on. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on your comment there, Lorena. Oitulo.
Cool. Pakaloflahi atu ki o tautolosi. My name's Janice. I was just teaching. I was merely coming from the point of a lot of youth, Niuean youth that I work with, in terms of the space that they only know what they know, and they don't necessarily get that taught in the schools, like in terms of books or researchers. I mean, there's just not enough of us coming through. And so, you know, they take things like the takalo and they perform it at the funeral where, you know, a lot of us have already been taught it's not where you're supposed to do it. But, you know, just in terms of the ever-changing diaspora for Niuean youth, and I guess that's the point I'm coming from, like you only know what you know in terms of that space. And you know, if it's not being taught in the schools or only being taught in a handful of schools, then that conversation or that narrative is going to change or not be the same from someone that's brought all the way up the far north or down in Invercargill in that space. And so that's kind of the stance I take in terms of supporting these youth, or in terms of the discussions we've had, in terms of the term savage. And I know people will say, you know, it's not a good word, but a lot of these youth come on board and they're so proud and they're bursting in terms of their Niuean culture, because that's one place where they feel like they can demonstrate that I'm Niuean and this is me putting Niue on the map. There's a lot of criticisms behind that, but in terms of that space, you know, I'm very supportive of our youth. But a lot of that also comes down with what do you do then? Like, where do you go? There's just not enough. That's what I'm saying. There's not enough. There just needs to be more out there for our youth to be able to uphold in terms of culture or in terms of learning. The want to know is there. The passion to know is there. It's just dependent on how that's delivered.
Yes, I think I'd have to agree with you, Janice. I know that there are big gaps for our young people in New Zealand, and I suppose this is our attempt at trying to fill a very small, fill something. Of course, we're not going to be able to fill it all, but we, all of us recognize that we need to do more in that space. Yeah, so this is part of it. I suppose it's our attempt, a group of us attempt of trying to do something, at least. I mean, I'd like to put it out there for a lot of you. What is the, where should we be heading in terms of trying to fill these gaps? Where there's a lot of discussion here today around that our young people need to understand some of the historical context, need to understand some of the cultures. So we understand all that, but where do we go? I mean, how are we going to get there? How are we going to ride that wako? There's lots of us doing, doing things. We're all trying to get there. So if there's any comments or any suggestions from people, do post them. I'm sure Eel will send them forward to us.
There's another question from Joanna, and it's about stories of how women have contributed to our history, why it is hard. Anna, if you're still with us, we'd love to hear your views. Anna?
No, she's still there.
Okay.
I have always thought and very strongly about our women of old and how they never, stories are never heard about them unless someone as such would say now, and it's just not told. Even the performance, as you shared, Rosa, from the farewell at the wharf, maybe a few, but it's not a story to be known and told and to be proud of, because nowadays the Feilo is only performed by warriors, and the long story about it, and it's just my sharing why is it not highlighted as much now, and it's a very strong history. Always a feeling and I say as well, the Pulotu so feeling it's make it ke hop ke tuho ni ke puhala is it was just a question that I wanted to pose. And wanting to hear more. It is very interesting to hear, and even how your research, short time as you have, but it does reflect where the story, and it's not told, it's not known. It's just like but I guess it's about time to tell those stories of our women and a great history that they have, and they have what's contributed to a lot of our family, our history as well.
guess that's another area that we're very, very limited on. On narratives, on the achievements of women and the strength of women, Niue women, from the past to today. As a matter of fact, very little has been acknowledged of the contributions by female Niue women to the growing and developing culture of Niue. It's an evolving culture, so we're all quite of what we have by the sound of a lot of things that were echoing through from our communities. I must add at this panel, I am at a great advantage for having born and raised in Niue, so I know a lot more about some of the narratives our old folks tell when we were young. So I was trying to be very quiet because I don't want to come across as I know everything. Except for wela ke hawa whakatūtala mai na matua.
Can I just add to that response is that it's not unusual that women are not in historical accounts, because that's across the board. When men wrote those histories, they wrote about themselves. And also we must remember that Niue is very much still a patriarchal society. And so although a lot of women do a lot of the work, the men are always the ones that take a lot of the credit. And this is no disrespect to the men, but it is to say that Niue, I feel, from my own perception, is that Niue is still heavily patriarchal. And with that comes a whole lot of issues around, women. But it shouldn't stop women from writing their own stories. I mean, here's a challenge for you. You're in Australia. I mean, one of the things you could do is interview a group of women in Australia and publish a book. And maybe that's the start of putting out more stories about women. So, Eo, have you indicated that we're nearly near the end?
Yeah, Chloe. One more question, otherwise we'll round it up, because we have to end it up by 4. I have another room where it needs to be used. Any other questions before we round it up, Chloe?
Hey, Posimani. Would you like to speak on your question or elaborate on your...
Marie's got her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Who's that? I'm not looking at the screen. I'm busy reading.
You can go first, Annette, if you like. No. I'm going to start by saying whakalawhalahi atu kia mitolu osi. Ko hingoa haku ko Marie Moka Pasisi, and ko tamaha matamo Peleveti Pasisi, and I was born in Mutalo in Niue. I was 3 years old when I left Niue and went to New Zealand. But somehow I learned the Wangahau Niue from my grandmother before she passed away when I was 6 years old. My dad recently passed away, and one of the last things he said was, do what you do, ge langaki and motu ko Niue, and langaki the tangata ko Niue. So for me, being raised in New Zealand and then living here now in Australia for over 30 years now, I was a little bit flabbergasted from, the subject title about what we were going to talk about. Like I came in here not I always go into Zooms not having an expectation of what's going to happen, but it is to do with perspective, with how we believe what the word Savage Island means. One of the things my dad named one of my sisters was Amazon woman. And I actually liken that to bravery and being fierce and being true. You know, so I guess there's nothing really wrong with the name Savage at the end of the day. I think there's lots of dialogue that needs to happen, but it does need to happen from a root, you know, to find out what that root cause is. There is just so much to unpack in the little time that we have. But you know, we talk about history and we talk about writing or rewriting things, but I think we also have to have that vision of moving forward. And there were only 3 dot points, I think, that Rennie put down. But obviously we know that there's so much more that we can do, not just from our youth, but also, you know, from our matua and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, so then we can pass that down to our children, and for our children to then pass that down to theirs. Yeah, and one of the notes that I did write down is, where did the notion come from that the Palangi is a higher rank, and why is it? I very much agree with Lorena. You know, why is it that we are still thinking that, you know, that is that's the way to go, when we should be writing our own story? And being that my background is a coaching, I am a coach, I am a consultant, and I have actually written a chapter in a book with 6 other authors. Like, I can sort of hear where we're going with this, but I think that there's a lot of other subjects that we need to use our dialogue and to use our you know, the lifting up of each other, you know, with men, both men and women, regardless of the gender, regardless of your age, regardless of whether you were raised in Niue or brought up in, you know, the Cook Islands or brought up here in Australia. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're all united. And I think, you know, we were talking about Christianity earlier in terms of the dark and the light. We should never really talk about the dark, because it's the stuff that when we go through the pain, that's when we learn the most, and that's when we become more resilient and we can help each other and lift each other up. So yeah, that's I wasn't actually going to say anything. I was just going to observe and listen, but Fawelahi, Iane, and the panelists, all of you, I've learned so much from you, but also our youth. And being someone who's in the 50+ category, Rosa, I would have liked to have responded, but I really don't think that 7 people is enough to sort of gauge, you know, where we, you know, the information that was provided. But yeah, there's just so much more to learn from this, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the session. So whakawailahi.
Thank you, Marie, for your comments. I think part of why we're trying to have this seminar series is to talk critically about things that are about Niue, and also, you know, and offer those opportunities for people to listen into. I think understanding the basis from where structural racism is in terms of New Zealand and our institutions, we really need to understand the root cause of it. Now, some Niueans will most probably never experience racism, or will see them, or, you know, and so they think that their lives are great and they've never had a racist encounter with anyone. But it's in our systems, and often it takes a very long time to really understand it. And yeah, and I think that we have to kind of look at, you know, to understand our histories, to understand what underpinned them, in order to be able to navigate a little bit more better in terms of what's happening today. It's intergenerational, it is there. I know a lot of people don't think it's there, but it is there in a lot of, in the ways that we are treated, in our position in society. So yeah, I think this is, you know, The seminar series is a way of just, discussing issues around Niue at a critical level and not so much at a descriptive level. So looking forward to the other sessions that are going to happen in the next 4 weeks. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, whakawelahi. I think as we're running out of time. I think this first session have enabled us to critically analyze and also discuss some of the issues surrounding the name Savage, and I think it's an ongoing discussion. But one of the things I picked up is that we need to create our resources now and make use of the opportunities and not having to wait around for other people. And I think we have that capability at the moment. We're well educated at different tertiary institutions and who are also holding different professions. So I encourage all our young Niue people or emerging academics or researchers. We need more resources and our stories needs to be told through many ways or any way that we can do that. But on that note, whakawela kia whai ma Pulotu ko Nuhi, pihia fo kia whai ma Rennie, pihia fo ki he Pulotu ko Rosa ke he mtoro tau Pulotu ko whalawhala mai he māmea honei. Next week, we'll be focusing on a perspective from religion. We have Matangi Vilitama, who will be speaking, will be presenting to us next week from Sydney, Australia. Whakawelahi, mga honei, manako ke tuku atu ke he tolu matua whiwhikau, ko Reverend Inga Mokole, ke whakausi e tolu ke hiliong. Whakawelahi.
Ko moe te rev.
Inga ko whea taua?
Ako at nyo kita kahau, ako niyo mo te ke mute. Okay, na pia te hamala makau ko kana hola ia. Furu ke fiafi. May Christ holy, healing, enabling spirit be with you every step of the way. May be your guide as your road changes and turn. Kia tu mau e atua e Pulotu mo e hokosi aki. E nganga hao i atua ke lata ia mo e waha, mo e mangaho kua hoko mai a mautoro kiai. Kia e ke tamna nei ha mautoro, ke whanawhanau mai ai e ta menamitaki. Ka kia whakamangaro atu, ka e ki kua hukia e wharu aloto ko e atua. Ka kia tupu mai e Pulotu mo loto matala ki hao tau tangata. Ko aole tamna nei ki hingo hao Yesu Kiriso. Amen.
Amen. Whakawelahi. Mitoro kia, wharewe he tapu kahau. Mana tu ke register.
Okay, whakaue.
Aya. Aya, matutake me maringa. Aya.
God bless.
Aya.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Aya.